Hello, this is Renn. Welcome back to the show. My special guest today is Ruy Teixeira, who is one of America's top political analysts. I'm sure you have seen his articles that have been in many of the leading publications over the course of many years. He's worked at a large number of Democratic think tanks over the years, including the Brookings Institution, the Progressive Policy Institute, and the Center for the American Progress. But he's now a non-resident senior fellow at the more conservative-leaning American Enterprise Institute, something I'll ask him about. He's also the co-founder of the Liberal Patriot, which is a great, thoughtful, reformist, center-left publication on Substack. I put a link to that in the show notes. I've written for it, and that's definitely something you should check out. So, Ruy, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
How does somebody go from working from the very progressive Center for the American Progress to AEI?
Well, it's definitely not something that everybody in my old milieu did, but I do think I wasn't the only one who over time felt that the intellectual atmosphere in the center left was deteriorating rapidly, that in fact it was pretty hard to talk about a number of topics in the context of sort of the center-left institutional world. But on that in particular, nobody really wanted to think very carefully or very hard about why working class voters were the ones who were moving away from the Democrats, while the college educated and more affluent were the ones moving toward the Democrats, which did not strike me as, really what we wanted out of a center-left party. And in tandem with that, I felt like progressives were starting to advocate for a lot of policies and principles that I just didn't think were even very consistent with being on the left or progressive, whatever you want to call it. And frankly, I got sick and tired of it. I think it got a lot worse after Trump got elected the first time. There were signs of it even before then, and I was worried about it. I was constantly trying to get people to, hey, the Obama thing, that was great, but it really didn't have a lot of staying power. There's still an enormous hole in the coalition in terms of the white working class in particular. And ways had to be figured out to get more of them back in the coalition, or you were very, very vulnerable. But after the Trump election, it's like nobody cared anymore even if they did before about this. It was all resistance all the time. Trump was a fascist, he was a racist, he was this, that, and the other thing. And of course, the only reason why anyone would ever vote for him is because they are that kind of person. They're, mortal words of Hillary Clinton, are deplorable. I found that was the hegemonic view on the left. And it was certainly the hegemonic view of the Center for American Progress. And I got into all kinds of arguments with people about this. They said, no, I don't think this is right. It's a really complex populist phenomenon. You've been railing for decades about the depredations of neoliberalism and the left behind communities. And now this is where the left behind communities have gone. And we need to think about that. Why did they do this? It's not just because they're racist or xenophobic. It's a much more complex story that has to do with how they feel the Democrats have also left them behind, and the elites of the Republican Party. They're mad as hell, and they're not going to take it anymore. So, but I found it was essentially impossible to have those conversations. And then, of course, famously, as you go deeper into the teens and get closer to 2020, more and more topics become, verboten. You can't talk about immigration in a certain way. You can't talk about crime in a certain way. You can't talk about race and gender in a certain way. You have to use a certain kind of approved language to talk about these things. And I was just like flabbergasted. I said, this is like, you're trying to give me a lobotomy here. I mean, we can't talk about anything anymore. This is really bad. Mm-hmm. It's not a healthy thing for a political party, a movement, to put so many things off limits to discussion. And, in addition to everything else, it's really boring. So I felt I had to get out of there, that I was no longer particularly welcome. I couldn't do the work I wanted to do. I couldn't have the conversations I wanted to have, do the research I wanted to do. And it was a stultifying atmosphere. And I found that I'd always had good relations with people on the right because I never believed, as so many of my erstwhile comrades did on the left, that all people on the right are, sort of tools of Satan, and they don't have any good motivations. They're not serious about what they believe. It's all smoke and mirrors to befuddle people into supporting their reactionary agenda. And I thought that was bullshit. I knew a lot of people on the right who were very smart. I mean, they had a different way of looking at things than I did. I'm a social democrat. They're not. They have a different view of history than I do, a different view of economics, but they're serious. I mean, they believe what they believe. And it's not like their arguments are completely crazy. We have to engage with this. We have to understand it. And out of that, your argument should get stronger and your ideas better. But, I was one of the few bothering to practice that at the Center for American Progress, I can assure you. So when I decided I needed to get out of Dodge, one logical place to start talking to people was at an AI, because I actually knew people there. I knew Carlin Bowman, and she introduced me to Yuval Levin. We had some talks. And, the next thing I knew, there I was at AEI. And they've been incredibly supportive and nice to me. I get to do what I want. I get to say what I want. I get to write what I want. I have good research assistants, good resources. And, people on the left don't understand this at all. I mean, I can't speak for other right-wing think tanks, which I think are more uniform, but a place like AEI is in a modest sort of way, kind of, I mean, it leans right, but there's people with all kinds of different points of view. There's no party line. There's no attempt to lobby Congress with the AEI view and policy X. And, there are people on staff who are ex-Democrats or still Democrats. There are people clearly on the junior staff who were more left and right leaning. It was,
they, especially since they moved up to DuPont Circle, right next to Brookings, basically, they do a lot of joint programs with the Brookings
Institution. They do a lot
Institution.
of joint programs, and those have been very good, I think, a lot of them. So, but again, it was a contrast with CAP, where search as you will, you could not find anyone who was remotely conservative or Republican in any way, manner, shape, or form. It was extremely homogeneous entity. And, I think that's again, I don't think that's good for thinking, which is the ostensible purpose of a think tank.
One of the things you're best known for is a 2002 book that you co-authored with John Judas called The Emerging Democratic Majority. And you mentioned Obama. In the Obama era, it looked like this was sort of materializing before our eyes. He did especially well in 2008. He even won the state of Indiana, where I live, which was incredible to think that a Democrat could win. And then it sort of all disappeared. What happened that things did not evolve the way that you saw them evolving? I guess, what was the thesis, and then what ended up happening?
Well, the thesis of the book was that the ways in which the country was changing demographically, economically, ideologically were kind of moving in the Democrats' direction, and that if they practiced a sort of what we call progressive centrism, which could connect to that evolving center of the American electorate and take advantage of these, in particular, demographic shifts that were likely going to benefit the Democrats, they could be in a pretty good position to dominate for a while. I mean, we started writing this during the first term of George W. Bush. Of course, when we were writing it, 9/11 happened. And, we met with a certain amount of skepticism when the book came out. Well, how can you talk about this? The Republicans are cleaning the Democrats' clock. And we said, well, I mean, we look at the underlying trends. We think
is this really kind of like diversification of the country? Be like a big piece
yeah,
of
well, I think people picked up on the most. We also talked about the rise of professionals, the shifting voting patterns among women. We talked about the changing voting patterns that you saw in metropolitan versus rural areas, and where the growth was happening in the country, and a lot of those places were moving toward the Democrats, where the most population economic growth was occurring. So we had a variety of different things going on there, but certainly one thing people picked up on was the way we talked about the rise of the non-white population, obviously primarily Hispanics, but also Asians, and that was definitely a thumb on the scales for the Democrats. But that, in a way, that part of it, of our argument, got Bowdlerized into the emerging Democratic majority thesis. It's like demographics is destiny. All Democrats have to do is wait for, the scales to continue shifting in their favor and mobilize those people, and then everything would be great. But they ignored, the progressive centrism part of the argument, and they certainly ignored something we spent significant time in the book talking about, which was trends among the white working class. That they were still the white non-college, still an enormous proportion of the country, particularly important in a lot of key swing states, the Rust Belt and so on. The Democrats had been losing ground among them, but if Democrats could maintain 40% share nationwide, more like 45 in the Rust Belt states, they should be able to keep their coalition together. But if there was further slippage, significant slippage, that would call the whole political arithmetic into question. So we did try to point out there are different trends moving in different directions in terms of both vote share and vote support, right? And it's perfectly possible for the mix of voters to change in a way that all else equal should benefit a given party like the Democrats, but for shifts against them among other groups to cancel that out. So after 2008, I think people were willing to anoint us as prophets, but of course it wasn't. Shortly thereafter, we had the 2010 election where the Democrats, got knocked upside the head with a 2x4, and the chief suspect there was again the white working class who bailed out from the Democrats en masse, even more than other voter groups. So it was at that point that John, Judas, and I started thinking, well, this is really something to keep an eye on. They don't, Democrats don't seem to be taking this seriously. Look what just happened. Of course, 2012, Obama runs a pretty good campaign, and kind of on a populist note, Mitt Romney was a good target. And they come back and claw some of that support back, particularly in the upper Midwest. But this was not anything people paid attention to, really. It was more like, this is further proof that the Democrats will benefit from these demographic changes. They're mobilizing their rising constituencies. That's really what it's all about, and completely leaving out the part where they actually recovered significantly among white working class voters. So, that is when we really started thinking, it doesn't look like people are really thinking about this in complicated enough and serious way, looking at some of these potential vulnerabilities. And it's something, again, I wrote about. I tried to get people to pay attention to. I tried to get something started there I once called the Bobby Kennedy Project, which is like going back to the original Bobby Kennedy and how he saw the importance of uniting black and white working class people and de-emphasizing race, emphasizing class and common interests and all that sort of thing. But I mean, it was already getting to that point in the second term of the Obama administration where it's becoming increasingly difficult to talk about things in that manner. And then, of course, circle back, we get to 2016, and that's when I feel like, the ability of people on the left to think clearly about American politics really starts to decline quite significantly. It's almost like people were mad at me. Hey, what about this emerging Democratic majority? But you didn't understand what we were talking about. We had a much more complicated analysis, and you just paid attention to the stuff you liked, and you ignored the stuff you didn't. And this is what you get. This is what you get for ignoring real problems. But again, that's not something people really wanted to hear. And I found myself becoming increasingly less popular in left circles as I attempted to keep on making these points.
It probably started before, the 2002, but certainly since the book came out, it seems like that the parties have radically scrambled their coalitions to some extent. I mean, that probably overstates it, since probably most of the actual people who are there are the same. But people would have said, I think historically, the Republicans are the party of the rich, and certainly like the Chamber of Commerce style corporate professionals in the suburbs, and the Democrats were the party of the intelligentsia and minorities and the working class. And now I guess there's this sense that a lot of that has changed, that Republicans, yes, they're still the ultra rich, the billionaires still like Republicans. There's still plenty of those, but the Republicans have really lost the appeal of the suburban educated demographics, while they've picked up tremendous working class support. And there's been a shift from the minority vote heavily towards the Republicans, particularly among Hispanics, whereas the Democrats are now, there's still still plenty of rich people that like them now too, and they've got the intelligentsia, and they're now this kind of upscale suburban kind of white party in a sense. And they still have, of course, blacks continue to vote overwhelmingly Democrat, but maybe it's less monolithic than it used to be. I think about growing up in the 1980s in southern Indiana in the 9th District, a very working class area. It was represented by Lee Hamilton for a very long time. It was 100% Democrat. I remember the first time I voted, they had like a piece of paper where they wrote the ballot that people pulled. When I walked into the polling place, every single person there pulled a Democratic ballot. And if you'd ask those people, why do you vote Democrats? Because the Republicans are the party of the rich, Democrats are the party of the working man. I mean, it would have been that simple.
Yeah.
And
well,
now that area is 100% Republican. And the working man thinks the Republican party's for them, and the Democrats are like, how does this happen?
There's interesting data that just shows that, I think it comes from the National Election Studies, which things do you associate with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And for the Democratic Party, back in the era you're initially talking about, it's like, oh, they're the party of the working class. That's what I associate with the Democrats. And you see this line just going to sharply declining over time, where fewer and fewer people think associate Democrats with the working class, and more people associated with, I don't know, diversity, equity, inclusion, or something like that, sort of racial issues or what have you. Anyway, I mean, the whole working class ID thing is really sort of gone by the wayside there. There's so many like data points on how these coalitions have shifted. Well, famously in this election, the Democrats carried voters with, Harris carried voters with over 100,000 or more in family income, and she lost all the income groups below that. In terms of, look at it by education, Harris probably lost working class or non-college voters as a whole by 12 points, which is triple the deficit Biden had in 2020. And then, go back to Barack Obama in 2012, they were still carrying the working class as a whole by, 4 or 6 points or whatever it was. So these are big shifts. One of my favorite little factoids from 2012 to 2020, I should update this for the new data, but if you compare those two elections with roughly similar Democratic margins, you see the white college educated margin for the Democrats improved by 16 points. And you see the Democratic advantage among non-white working class voters declined by 19 points. So that tells you a lot about what's happening. I think if you actually compare 2024 to 2012, you've got to splice some different data here together, but you basically see the non-white working class margin for the Democrats cut in half from about 67 to 32 or 33 points. And that's really what's driving the movement of non-whites in class terms away from the Democrats. And of course, the Democrats continue to get absolutely hammered among white working class voters. Probably was around 30 points in this election in terms of a deficit. So put all that together, you see this working class shift, election on election away from the Democrats that includes non-whites. And you see the Democrats holding their own and improving among college educated voters, particularly white college educated voters, which is like, it wasn't that long ago Democrats lost white college educated voters. People forget this, but it's true. Yeah, they had sort of the intelligentsia, quote unquote, but that wasn't, that's not the sum total of white college educated voters.
It's a narrow stratum.
But among that group now, it's pretty dominant to vote Democratic, and of course, particularly in certain areas of the country. Also, if you look at congressional districts, the ones that have the highest income and education levels are almost all Democratic now, which is like weird, right? I mean, again, you going back to your childhood, right? It's like, the Republicans, they're the party of the rich and the highfalutin. But it's now the Democrats who really occupy that slot.
Do you think that, again, some of the race, what we see among Hispanics or other minorities shifting to the Republican Party is primarily a class phenomenon?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Primarily.
Yeah.
I mean, it's linked to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's easy for me to see that's the case. There's certainly an economic dimension, but it strikes me there's a cultural dimension as well. And when I grew up in rural southern Indiana, and you move to Chicago and you see the kind of Hispanic neighborhoods, there are a lot of Mexican neighborhoods, working class.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of the ways that they are is very reminiscent of where I grew up. It's like, a bunch of neighborhood guys get together with a case of beer, working on the car in the garage. I'm like, this is exactly what I grew up with, kind of thing. And there are kind of like some cultural resonances between these groups.
Oh, yeah. If you look at the ideological, self-reported ideological inclinations of Hispanics, for example, they're overwhelmingly moderate to conservative. And they're not just saying that, they really are moderate to conservative. And, I live in an area of Silver Spring that's adjacent to a Latino working class area. And so I'm very familiar with sort of those communities. And, maybe that's one of the reasons why I wasn't as surprised as some to see some of these shifts, because it was clear to me that the way the Democrats were changing culturally and their attitudes toward working class people and their culture, I didn't see why this was going to play well with the kind of Latino working class people I was familiar with.
Latinx or Latinx or whatever that thing is. Like, what is it?
It's all insane, So, you want, if you're a Latino working class person or any other person, you want you to feel comfortable with the party you're voting for. Feel like you're not voting for a party that looks down on you. Feel, voting for a party that's on your side and kind of gets you. And I think that's really part of why Democrats have been losing altitude among these kinds of voters. Democrats just seem off on, a lot of weird tangents. They have a different way, they even have a different language in terms of the way they talk about things. They're concerned about issues that for your median Latino working class voter is like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Trans women, trans girls, and trans women in women's sports, and your pronouns, and sort of sex is optional or something. I mean, they may not think a lot about those things, but when they hear them, it suggests to them Democrats are on another planet than I am, and I'm not really comfortable with that, and it makes me take them less seriously. I mean, that was really the secret sauce of the famous Trump ad. Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you. It wasn't so much that transgender issues were this like super salient issue in and of itself, but what it symbolized, what it captured in terms of Democrats' cultural outlook and the lack of relationship of that to what people were most concerned about. That really, I think, resonated. And I think it's interesting to see what's happening with that today. Democrats are not backing down on it, despite the overwhelming polling evidence that, people are, not only are they hostile to a lot of this stuff at this point, they're getting more hostile over time. The data is pretty clear on this. But, when they had the Protect Women and Girls in Sports Act that was put before the House, only 2 Democrats voted for it. 2. And they were both conservative Texas Hispanic Democrats. Even Seth Moulton didn't vote for it, who actually dared to raise a question. This is a Democratic representative from Massachusetts. He dared to raise a question.
They tried to cancel him.
They tried to cancel him. He's accused of being a Nazi, a transphobe. The Salem Democratic Party, which is his hometown, wanted him to force him to resign. His staff members resigned. I mean, this is such a hot button issue among that stratum of people in the Democratic Party that even someone like Seth Moulton could not get away with. And, he winds up not voting for that bill, presumably because he felt he'd already done himself enough damage by saying what he actually thought about something, instead of indulging in what I think a lot of Democrats do these days, which is preference falsification. They say a lot of stuff they don't really mean because, they know if they don't say it, bad things will happen. And so I think we're still in that space where many, many Democrats are really afraid to not falsify their preferences.
I could talk about these things all day, but I want to give us a chance to talk about Trump.
Okay.
When did you first realize the Trump phenomenon was real?
Good question. I I don't want to like. I mean, I guess I would have to indict myself along with many other people in the early days of the Trump candidacy in 2016, 2015, 2016. I didn't take it seriously. I thought, oh, you know, name recognition. He's just a showman. It'll all disappear. And then, like everyone else, I realized, hey, this guy's probably going to get the nomination. So therefore, we do have to take him seriously. But then, I really, unlike some people like Selena Zito or some other people, maybe you, I was still skeptical that he could possibly beat Hillary, who, though I realized was not a good candidate. I just didn't think. I couldn't wrap my mind around the idea that he would be able to do it. And I paid too much attention to the polling data and occupational hazard of doing what I do and looking at what I look at. The polling data was very much overestimating Clinton's margin, particularly in key states, and did not pick up some of the late movement toward him, and clearly was just undersampling Trump voters. We now know that to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I would tell you that people just did not realize it. I mean, I was working at the Manhattan Institute at the time, and even internally to the Manhattan Institute, people didn't believe it.
Yeah, right.
Maybe it's because you're in New York. I'm like, I'm telling people, I never predicted he would win per se, but I always told people, even go back to 2015, this guy is legitimate.
Right.
And I did write the lead article for City Journal about his election victory the afternoon of election day. I'm like, I'm just going to go ahead and write the victory article and send it in.
Right.
It ran.
Well, you were smarter than me, man. It took me a while to catch on.
I got to have it ready to go.
But afterwards, to my credit, I guess, I quickly pivoted to trying to understand how this had happened. And it didn't take very long for the orthodox narrative to start setting in about why Trump won. It was, again, the deplorables, the racism,
fascism,
and it was incipient fascism, and we must resist. And I looked at this and I immediately said, no, this is not right. This is not how you're going to be able to beat this kind of political movement. We now know this is a serious deal. Yeah, he's going to screw up, but if you want to maximize your probability of beating him and keeping his kind of politics out of, the halls of government, you got to really take seriously how he managed to appeal to all the voters he did manage to appeal to. And you can't write them off. You can't categorize them as being the troglodytes and the unenlightened. And, again, back to what I was saying earlier, it's not fallen receptive ears. But I think one interesting thing about what you're saying, Aaron, and my reaction as well is, I don't know if you read Musa El-Garbi's new book on woke. He has.
I had him on the show too.
I had him on my show too. He's great. In the first part of the book, he talks about, I think he had basically arrived at Columbia around the time the 2016 election happened, and has a hilarious recounting of the reactions among the so-called intelligentsia there about. They were just so shocked. They couldn't function. They were crying. They were like, oh, the world has ended. I lost faith in America. And meanwhile, the janitors and the food service workers have to come in and do their jobs. And they seem perfectly fine, But everybody he knew in his academic circles, people were just losing it right and left, They needed to have comfort dogs and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that's indicative of how deep the analysis went in most liberal circles after Trump's victory. It was more, the urge was not to understand, the urge was to condemn and to grieve. And that was, I think, not very productive.
You hear a lot of people, or at least some people, argue that Trump is basically a Bill Clinton style 90s Democrat. I'm curious if you think that that's true or has truth, and who is the best historical analog to Trump in American politics?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure how to answer it. What are the elements of Trump that would be similar to Clinton? I guess, you could argue that.
Well, Clinton was the Mr. Trade Deal guy, so I don't think it was trade.
Right. It wasn't trade, but I guess, Clinton was willing to annoy people by some of the things he said about welfare and crime and things like that. And certainly Trump is, even though he's in a different party, is willing to tweak people about that. I mean, in terms of how he rose within his own party, there's, I guess, a similarity in the sense that Clinton moves up in the Democratic Party, becomes their candidate, and sort of hegemonizes Democratic politics for a while because he's willing to say stuff that really annoy other people in the party, and it draws lines between him and people he thought were really leading the party astray. And Trump did the same thing in 2016 when he arose, right? I mean, he made various statements on trade, on entitlements, and among a bunch of other things that were not the typical fare for Republicans at that point. He really did strike a populist note on those kinds of issues, and even on immigration, he was much more hardline. That was not sort of in the Orthodox Republican playbook. So he annoyed a lot of those people. But I don't know.
There is a speech. It might be.
Yeah, go ahead.
I say it might be one of Clinton's State of the Union addresses. Somebody sends me the clip. It's like him talking about illegal aliens and like we can't let them in. Let. It's like it could have been a Trump speech.
Right.
I think maybe the point of people saying that is America was just much closer to being on Trump's wavelength in that area. Is there somebody that you think this is the way, the best analog to Trump in history, in a kind of American political history?
Like I say, that's a good question. I'm having a hard time coming up with anyone who seems very...
Yeah, me either. I feel like we'll never see another person like Trump again. I mean, just such a phenomenon. He is a larger-than-life American character. You recognize something of an archetypal American character in him. Right. But like, I've just never seen
I'm with you, brother. I'm with you. I mean, one thing that I think this election has underscored for me, and I'm hardly the only person saying this, and this gets at the issue of taking him seriously. Now we really have to get in touch with the idea he's like a great politician, and in some, whether you like him or not, kind of a great president. I mean, he's put his mark on things. I mean, he is an enormous force. Mm-hmm. He's not just like this kind of bizarre guy who popped up out of Trump Tower and was an object of derision among many. I mean, you have to take this man seriously and what he represents. And I still find that's not the case in a lot of liberal circles. I mean, they just want to hate him. They don't want to think he could be smart. He could be interesting. He could be like this powerful phenomenon. They don't want to, in a sense, give him credit for anything other than manipulating the befuddled masses. Which I think
he's good at that, maybe. But there is a sense like that when he was shot in Pennsylvania and got up and pumped his fist in the air and said, "Fight, fight!" Like, you can't fake that.
Right.
People can see there's something about this guy. Right. Like, what other politician would have got up after being shot, even just grazed? You're in shock, you know what's going on, and your first instinct is to get back up straight.
Right.
And call your...
You got to give credit to the guy. He is a phenomenon, and he's not just a show. He's for real.
What are the optimistic and the pessimistic scenarios for Trump 2 here?
Well, I mean, a lot of people have a lot of scenarios they contemplate. Certainly one scenario is, I mean, you could already see it in his exec orders and some of the things he's already doing and saying. He just goes too far too fast. I mean, big thermostatic reaction. Everything seems chaotic. Maybe the economy doesn't cooperate very well. Maybe there's another spike in inflation because of some of the things he does, maybe these tariffs or whatever else. But you could certainly see a situation in which, despite the goodwill of these first period of time of him being in office and people willing to give him another chance, you could see them in a fairly short orders saying, hey, this guy hasn't really changed. He still can't run the government very well. And things are not returning to normal. What I want is more normal than Biden had, more normal than, more what Biden promised than what he delivered. I want things to seem like they're humming along, that he is making America great again. He's making my life great again. But if people don't believe that, then maybe he'll chew up his goodwill pretty fast. The Democrats will lose the House in 2026. And, then Josh Shapiro beats J.D. Vance in 2028, and Republicans are back out in the wilderness. However, I think there's a scenario where, Yasha Monk wrote about this in a column the other day. I thought was very good about to understand Trump, don't just think about him appealing to the downtrodden, left behind, and culturally alienated, which he does, but think about it as he's channeling a kind of aspirational populism. People want America to be great again. They want a country that's powerful and moving ahead and dynamic and prosperous and
territorially expanding.
There's nothing we can't do. We're Americans, that sort of thing, right? And, maybe he gets that vibe going and keeps it going. And maybe the economy cooperates. Maybe some of these ties that Trump is developing with some of the big tech bros and some other powerful economic actors really pay off. Maybe the big AI productivity boom hits while he's in office. I don't know, but you could definitely, and he presses the cultural buttons he's pressing now, but he avoids going head over heels on this stuff, like tripping himself up. And, basically people wind up saying, hey, this is pretty great. They got rid of DEI programs. They don't have to worry about pronouns anymore. Whatever. That the things he's pushing forward, in the end, sit relatively well with people is like, okay, yeah, this is an improvement. And he's not as crazy as I thought. And some of the things he's done I agree with. So I think under that scenario, you could see, the Republicans continuing to do well, J.D. Vance running and winning in 2028, and the Democrats are out in the cold for a while. And that would be assisted by something I wrote about today in my column for the Liberal Patriot about the left basically sort of being willing to die on many different hills in terms of opposing Trump, even the popular things he's for, and basically preventing the Democrats from presenting a significantly different brand than they did before to try to combat Trump and the Republicans. In other words, the Democratic Party could be in ineffective chaos for a while itself, which will assist Trump and the Republicans in terms of making this term of his productive and building up their base and developing even more working class support. I can see that happening, but I can see the first part too. So I don't know. All to play for.
Maybe both at the same time.
Maybe both at the same time.
What do the Democrats need to do to get back in the game?
Well, I once wrote a piece that I sort of rejiggered a couple times in light of changes in politics and so on, that I called the 3-point plan to fix a Democratic coalition. And it was 3 parts. One was move to the center on cultural issues. The second was promote an abundance agenda. And third, embrace patriotism and liberal nationalism. So I felt if they could do all those things, that would be a real improvement on the current party brand. And, I think the moving to the center on cultural issues seems pretty obvious at this point, right? We know the Democrats are out of step with the median voter on so many of things, these things having to do race, gender, immigration, crime, a whole trans set of issues. It should be possible for the Democrats to move to the center on these issues, basically by embracing the common sense part of where people are coming from in these issues, but trying to draw a line between that and what might be portrayed as more extreme approach by Trump and some of his acolytes. So you sort of, by moving to the center, you are able to capture, take away some of the juice that Trump is getting from basically being willing to talk about popular things that Democrats aren't willing to talk about. And you can set up a contrast between you, the moderate party, and Trump, the extreme party. But if they stick to their guns on all this stuff, right, on the trans issues, on immigration, on crime, on sort of ideological anti-racism, what have you, if they're not willing to signal to voters, we don't believe that stuff anymore. We're not into identity politics. That's not us. We're for you. I think their job will be a lot harder. And an abundance agenda, I think that Democrats have spent a bit too much time worrying about climate change and sort of seeing that as somehow the key to prosperity, which I think at this point it clearly isn't. I mean, Trump is now pushing very hard on an abundance agenda for energy, which actually is extremely popular if you look at the polling data, and actually in policy terms, probably a pretty good idea. And you give people what they want: cheap, abundant, reliable energy, and you'll have them eating out of the palm of your hand. So Democrats need to adopt some of that, and they need to really take a careful look about the ways in which they're too invested in the regulatory structure of the country in such a way that it prevents things that need to be done to get done, right? I mean, it's too damn hard to build stuff in this country. And right now, Republicans kind of own that shtick, though it's essential to the abundance agenda to get stuff out of the way that's preventing things you want done, and preventing good governance. I mean, good Lord, the Democrats, if you want your city governed well, I mean, is the first thing you think, I want to hire a Democrat? I don't think so. I think the way things are now, or if you want a project done fast, what's the first thing you do? Hire a Democrat. No, I don't think so. Democrats really need to change that image and say, we are all about abundance. We all are about getting rid of obstacles. We are all about building and doing things fast, quickly, efficiently, and so on. And I think that would do a great deal to get Democrats out of this sort of, we must go slow with everything. There's all these environmental considerations. What about the climate, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is a loser.
Right.
It's a loser with most voters. I mean, we know this. But it's not all. The problem is it's like a sacred, sort of a sacred set of beliefs among the people who dominate the Democratic Party, among the groups, among the lefties who staff so much of the infrastructure of the various institutions that surround the Democratic Party, what John and I called in our book, the shadow party. But they've got to jettison that, because that's not where the masses are at. And I think it's very unclear that, that agenda is very effective anyway in giving people what they want. I mean, of course, the Green New Deal was supposed to, deliver everything at cheap prices and fantastic jobs for everybody. Nobody believes that anymore, if they ever did. So, so get rid of that and then embrace patriotism and liberal nationalism. I mean, clearly the Democrats still have a patriotism deficit. I've documented that. In the, Democratic convention this year, or last year, they tried to kind of do a reset on that, but I don't think anyone took it too seriously. And, they have years of damage to repair in terms of their party's attitude toward patriotism. America is good. It is not fundamentally a white supremacist society that is responsible for most of the evil in the world. I mean, why would anyone feel like, oh, that sounds great, I want to sign up for the Democrats because they're for the fact that we're a terrible country, So I don't think that works either.
Yeah, on the abundance agenda, I think the Republicans talk a good game on that stuff. The real question is, can they actually do it? Because it requires a lot of detailed policy expertise. And
this is a problem for them. They don't have the horses to do a lot.
Yeah, I think that's a problem. I've always said the actual ideas on that are probably going to come out of the center left. But can we get it done? I think it's going to be a challenge for both parties on that. You mentioned liberal nationalism, and I want to just conclude by asking you about the Liberal Patriot, the name the Liberal Patriot. Is this your attempt to address that issue? Maybe you could tell people about the Liberal Patriot before we sign off.
Yeah, no, it totally is. It is our idea to address that. We, the origins of the Liberal Patriot go back to a cabal of people at CAP who we just started talking to each other like every week or so about what was going on with politics. This was during the COVID pandemic. And, we were just becoming increasingly dissatisfied with, the way the whole left, center left was evolving, the kinds of ridiculous rabbit holes they were going down. Certainly the 1619 Project was popular at the time. And we thought, I mean, this is like totally bonkers. You're not going to be able to sell the American public on, this idea that America is born in slavery, marinated in racism and white supremacy to this very day. Mm-hmm. But it was exactly the kind of thing you couldn't talk about at CAP anymore, because that was just the conventional wisdom. I mean, Nicole Hannah-Jones said it. I mean, this is George Floyd's time. I mean, it was madness, right? So we thought there has to be a really fundamentally different approach here that really seriously grapples with the way most Americans really think about the world and what the real history of our country is, and that emphasizes practical, not ideological solutions, but still, retains a commitment to core, if you want to call them liberal values in terms of the role of government and, sort of what policy should be oriented toward. And so we groped around with that for a while. We thought maybe we'd write a manifesto and put it on the internet. Yeah, it wouldn't have any effect. And then we discovered Substack, which was an easy way of putting our stuff out there in a user-friendly fashion. It wouldn't cost us a nickel because we didn't monetize it to begin with. And so we just started writing, and the rest is history. But we did consciously want to provide an alternative that embodied those kinds of approaches to democratic politics that I outlined. That there really had to be a reset. The Democrats were going down the wrong path, and indeed were at times advocating for things that we didn't even think were very left or progressive in any way, really. And this was fucked up. so we decided we'd try to put out a different analysis. And I think now there are a few more of us out there trying to make these points, but I think it's still slow going within the Democratic Party itself. But we'll see what happens in the next months and years.
Indeed, it's probably not going to be boring. There'll be plenty to write about for our various publications, that's for sure.
Indeed, sir.
And there is a link to the Liberal Patriot in the show notes. Ruy Teixeira, co-founder of the Liberal Patriot, thank you for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Aaron. It was fun.